believe it or not, sometimes my kids do watch my sermons. And my last sermon, my youngest son said I was a little monotone and overall just not very animated. So, problem solved, right? Welcome to my drawing room.
A day without laughter is a day wasted.
I personally believe in reducing waste. Waste not, want not is my motto. So I waste no opportunity for a good joke, or as close as I can get to one at any given moment. And my friends and family want me to keep my jokes to myself. But have you ever laughed inappropriately? And I don't just mean at my jokes. Or have you been unable to control your laughter at exactly the wrong moment? Have you ever been the only one in the room laughing at a joke that no one else got? And is there something that can always make you laugh? You see, there's this lady at work who, if you really get her going, she snorts. And it's quite a matter of pride if we can get her to snort in a meeting, especially now in these Zoom meetings from miles apart. But you see, there's not a person on earth who hasn't laughed at the wrong time or giggled in a solemn moment or guffawed themselves into tears, no matter how embarrassing at that time. 19th century thinker William Osler once said, "Laughter is the music of life." You see, this is a music we can all hear and relate to. It's a common tongue that is rarely misunderstood. Our passage today concerns laughter. Genesis 18 and 21 tell the story of a strange visit in Abraham's life, an equally strange promise, and the laughter that followed, and the even greater laughter that followed after that. Let me introduce you to Abraham.
Hi, I'm Abraham. Jesus is my really great grandson. One could even say that as far as faith goes, I'm kind of the spiritual grandpa of all who call themselves Christians. So sit back and listen up, you young'uns. This is my story. I don't have much grass out here in the Oaks of Memory. It's quite a bit different from that garden some people got kicked out of years ago.
Anyway, we're here in the desert with a very old man and his elderly wife.
Hey now.
They're living here. And apparently doing very well.
That's better.
So they, their family, and their servants are nomads. They move from season to season to best care for their cattle and their flocks. Let's take a look at our passage in Genesis 18, verse 1. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. The heat of the day was siesta time. It was too hot to do anything but rest. It was a time of day when there wasn't the distraction of work or activity. Just them listening to the wind batter the tent, and perhaps wondering what in the world God was up to. It seems that God often meets us when we have nothing to do. Have you heard more of God in this time of quarantine? God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of great nations, but that was years ago. And now he and his wife's bodies are well beyond being capable of having children. But here Abraham is, and he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them. Hospitality was vitally important in that society to both the visitor and the host. The traveler meant trading goods and news from far away, or at least some sort of companionship. And the way Abraham greets them at first would have been very typical. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth.
O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant.
This was common. Hospitality was a matter of survival for both the host and the guest. I know that right now some people would be very excited to be able to get together and meet with some guests instead of being stuck all by themselves. But what's interesting here is that Abraham offers them, first, a good foot washing, some rest, and a bit of bread. He makes them comfortable, gives them an opportunity to clean the filth off their feet, and a repast. The progression of how he hosts them is interesting too. Let's look at the following verses. And Abraham went quickly to the tent to find Sarah.
Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make cakes.
And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and he gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared, and he set it before them, and he stood by them under the trees while they ate. It was decades previously that God took Abraham out under the stars and told him that his descendants would outnumber even these. The promise had been held out in front of him and Sarah several times now. They had even given up, and Abraham fathered Ishmael with Sarah's servant girl. But now, on this random day in the desert place, God shows up. Abraham feels an old lightning strike in his heart, and something in his brain quickens. Isn't this how God comes to us sometimes? Someone comes out of nowhere, and you suddenly realize God is speaking. We ask for God's guidance or reassurance, and then, in an otherwise humdrum exchange, God answers our prayer. And God often comes to us in the form of ordinary aspects of our lives. People, relationships, circumstances. Pay attention. Don't expect him to just come to you when you're being churchy. He uses every crayon in the box, so don't draw conclusions of what you need to do to gain his favor. One of the most famous stories of this is St. Augustine. He eventually became one of the most important theologians in church history. He even has his own day on the Orthodox calendar, which happens to be tomorrow. But he started out as a spoiled rich kid who took part in cults and had a famous appetite for women. He eventually became acutely aware of his sin and was in tears wondering if he would ever be delivered from it. He was crying one day in the garden, and he heard a child singing,
Take up and read, take up and read.
So he picked up his Bible and he read a passage in Romans. Let us walk properly, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. God called him out of his old life and into holiness. He dropped everything and went on to become one of the great minds of the church. All because he heard a child, or an angel, or maybe both, speaking to him from over a wall. Now, if you have kids, you know that God can speak to you even through them. Their wonder in life and their undefeated joy is an echo of heaven. You can hear it if you're listening. But even more mundane, just an encouraging word from someone can be a reminder of God's promise. You probably won't notice right away, but it may become apparent to you that the voice speaking to you is not just that of a friend or an obnoxious coworker, or a total stranger, but that God himself is answering your prayer or showing you the direction to go. And then it's on you. It's about how you respond and how quickly. Abraham goes from a polite, ordinary greeting to hosting to putting out an entire feast for these messengers of God. And more than likely, one of these may have been Christ himself. Although we won't know until we see him in person. Even the challenging people in our lives or the needy people we meet can be a conduit of God's love and life.
I see Jesus in every human being. I say to myself, this is hungry Jesus. I must feed him. This is sick Jesus. This one has leprosy or gangrene. I must wash him and tend to him. I serve because I love Jesus.
But how do we react? Often, we have the reaction of Sarah, Abraham's wife. They've both been promised a few times now that they will be the parents of a great lineage. And nothing has happened. Except for age, the only constant in their life. They've gotten older. They've even tried to bypass the process, to cheat, to do it their own way. That didn't work out, and they still have no baby. Just the desert wind and the waiting. So when these three men walk out of nowhere and make promises, she reacts like most of us probably would.
Where is Sarah, your wife?
She is in the tent.
I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son.
And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah.
After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?
Sarah laughed. In these completely understandable circumstances, she gave a tired, cynical chuckle. And who wouldn't? I imagine she was thinking what Art Linkletter would put into words centuries later.
If you can't think of anything else when you're my age, take off your clothes and walk in front of a mirror. I guarantee you'll get a laugh.
But it happens. A son, Isaac, was born to them within a year. The promise was delivered.
He will be named Isaac.
So I decided not to animate this next section. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. You're welcome. So Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him.
God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me.
That's a lady who doesn't take herself too seriously. She'd heard the promise of God and laughed. First with skepticism, and then with joy. When the promise finally came true, she named him Laughter. The name Isaac is close to the Hebrew word for laughter, Isaac, which is like the sound of laughter itself. And so we have the laughter promise. God walks out of the middle of the desert and speaks promise to them. Abraham reacts with faith. Sarah with cynicism. But even Sarah eventually gets in on the story and delivers the punchline in the form of her son, Isaac. This is the way the lineage of Jesus started, with a promise out of nowhere and with laughter. A promise fulfilled after their disastrous attempts to do it their own way. After their faith was long gone, the God of laughter was faithful. So what do we learn from this strange conversation? Because listen close. You never know what creative, counterintuitive way that God might speak to you and answer your prayers. It may be from an animated sermon you watch on YouTube, or it may be from someone you interact with in a Zoom meeting during quarantine. Pay attention. Don't write off anyone or any circumstance. One of the most successful pastors in the Washington, D.C. area, Lon Solomon, was converted by a mentally ill street preacher who used to scream the gospel at people. Now, as far as we know, this crazed street pastor only had one convert. But that man, Lon Solomon, would go on to lead thousands upon thousands of people to Christ. Learn from your laughter. Is there a promise you're waiting on? Is there somewhere you are laughing at God? Can you look back and see a time that He fulfilled a promise you had given up on or tried to fix your own way? A relationship restored? An addiction healed? A marriage resurrected? Where are the laughter promises in your past? How can they encourage you today? Because, and I believe this, humor is a prelude to faith, and laughter is the beginning of prayer. This was said by Reinhold Niebuhr, and it's more true today than ever. So laugh often at yourself, at any joy you can find in your life, and the absurdity of your decisions apart from God. Just as Sarah laughed at the laughter promise, that blessing that came when all seemed lost and the desert had taken the day. After all, Voltaire put it this way: God is a comedian playing to an audience too afraid to laugh. Don't give in to that fear. Sarah wasn't afraid. She may have been skeptical at first, but she laughed her way through her circumstances, and it became a blessing to her. After all, laughter requires no social distancing, and it brings us closer together as a people and closer to God. So I pray that this message finds you well, that it gave you a respite from your fears, and that you can find the laughter in your heart and share it with everyone you can. God bless you until we see you again. Farewell.